He lifted his fork, ready to taste a $700 steak, but the folded napkin beneath his plate stopped him cold. 4 words scribbled in shaky ink, "They spit in your food," would not just ruin his dinner. They would expose a system of quiet cruelty and ignite a reckoning no one in that restaurant saw coming. The linen napkin looked ordinary at first glance, folded neatly beneath the rim of a silver plate. But when Malcolm DeVoe lifted it, when he saw the jagged handwriting pressed into the fabric, the room around him seemed to still. "Today they spit in your food. This place is not safe." The words struck harder than any market headline, harder than any betrayal across a boardroom table. He froze, fork poised midair, the $700 presidential prime steak untouched before him. In the low light of the cradle, a Charleston institution of velvet drapes and candlelit prestige. The message read like a detonator. Malcolm had survived investors pulling out at the last second, rivals plotting coups in glass towers, but this was different. This was not business. This was personal. He didn't look up immediately. He didn't scan the room in suspicion. He kept his breath steady, his gaze lowered, as though studying the marbling of the beef, but his pulse betrayed him. The note was not a complaint, not a gimmick from a competitor. It was a warning written in fear, the kind of fear that trembled through the strokes of each letter. Whoever slipped it knew the risk. Whoever slipped it knew he had to see it. He replayed the moment in his head, just seconds earlier when the waitress, eyes tired but alert, uniform pressed though the shoes were worn down, had placed the plate before him. There had been the faintest hesitation in her hand, a flicker in her gaze. She had not spoken, had not lingered, just performed the ritual of service like any other night. Only now did he understand what else she had given him. Malcolm's mind calculated reflexively, years of data-driven instinct parsing the phrase. "They spit in your food, clear, deliberate, not an accident. This place is not safe." Bigger than a single act of malice, broader, systemic. He had eaten worse in his travels incognito. But safety, that word carried weight beyond the plate. It spoke of rot at the root, of a culture masked by linen and candlelight. He folded the napkin once more, slid it into the inner pocket of his hoodie, and let the fork fall silent against the table. He had come here dressed like an ordinary man, plain navy hoodie, off-brand sneakers, jeans washed thin by time. No one in the room had recognized him. That was the point. The cradle was not just a restaurant, it was a theater of old Charleston wealth, a stage where appearances were currency. To them, he was invisible, and yet someone had seen him. Someone had chosen him. The hum of conversation around him continued, laughter rising from tables draped in white, glasses clinking under chandeliers. But for Malcolm, the sound faded into static. His attention narrowed to the napkin's message replaying in his mind, each word a pulse of urgency. He glanced once toward the service corridor where the waitress had disappeared, the door swinging shut behind her. He could still feel the slight tremor in her fingers as she cleared his bread plate, the way her left hand had slipped the napkin under the setting without a word. It had been quick, precise. Practice, not an accident. She had made a choice, and choices like that came with a cost. Malcolm leaned back in his chair, eyes fixed on the untouched steak glistening under the warm light. He did not lift his knife. He did not take a bite. Instead, he let the silence stretch, let the weight of the message settle over him, because this night was no longer about dinner. It was about a secret whispered in ink, a truth hidden in plain sight, and the moment he chose to act. The performance of the cradle would begin to unravel. This wasn't a meal. It was the opening move of a reckoning. Malcolm DeVoe did not look like a billionaire that night. The hoodie was intentional, the sneakers chosen for their scuffed anonymity, the jeans plain enough to pass without comment. Most men in his position would have sent lawyers, PR strategists, maybe a quiet investigator with a clipboard and a hidden camera. But Malcolm believed some truths could only be found in silence, in the act of walking into the fire without a shield. It was not the first time he had done this. To understand him, you had to start far from the crystal glasses of the cradle, in a small town in Alabama where the sidewalks cracked and the heat pressed down on every dream. Malcolm was raised by his grandmother in a house with more memories than furniture. His mother scrubbed floors at night so her son could wear a shirt without holes to school. He still remembered the smell of bleach on her hands when she hugged him after double shifts, whispering that he was meant for more. His first computer was not a sleek machine with glowing logos, but a second-hand box pulled from a church donation pile, keys worn to the bone. He spent nights teaching himself coding from borrowed library books, the light of a single bulb stretching shadows across the room. By 24, he had turned a garage startup into an IPO that made headlines. By 46, he was the founder of Darrow Capital Holdings, with interests in clean energy, fintech, and luxury hospitality. He sat on corporate boards, drove a black Tesla Model S, lived in a penthouse overlooking Central Park. On paper, he was power incarnate, but success never erased memory. It only buried it deeper. That was why he dressed simply. No gold watches, no designer shoes, no attempt to armor himself in labels. He understood how quickly a black man could be judged by what he wore before anyone listened to what he said. He wore invisibility like a tool, and tonight, invisibility was exactly what he needed. 2 weeks earlier, an anonymous letter had landed on his desk. It was typed, unsigned, and shaking with anger between the lines. It accused one of his flagship restaurants in Charleston of racial bias in service, of suspicious practices in the kitchen, of a culture that humiliated black customers and employees. He had read it twice, then 3 times. He knew the easy route: forward it to compliance, let a law firm investigate, release a polished statement. But Malcolm also knew the cost of polished statements. They smoothed over the truth. They dulled the edges. They turned fire into paperwork. So he bought a Greyhound ticket, packed nothing but the hoodie and sneakers, and walked through the front doors of the Cradle himself. No entourage, no introduction, no reservation. Just another man who could be ignored. He did it because he understood something most executives never did. Systems hide behind performance. And the only way to see the rot was to sit in the corner, to order the food, to breathe the same air as those the system treated like ghosts. Malcolm had done this before. In his 20s, he once walked into a fintech branch under a false name, exposed a scheme that nearly robbed hundreds of families. Years later, he booked a room at one of his own hotels using a prepaid card, uncovered staff practices that discriminated against low-income guests. He never forgot what he saw in those moments. Because when you strip away the title, when you remove the armor of wealth, people reveal themselves. They show you who they think matters and who they think doesn't. That was the test. That was why Malcolm sat now at a table by the swinging kitchen doors, the smell of bleach leaking into the candlelight, the sound of laughter echoing from the chandeliered hall. The contrast was not lost on him. In New York, he slept on Egyptian cotton sheets, woke to a skyline of power. In Charleston, he was a man in a hoodie being measured by a hostess's narrowed eyes, and he preferred it this way, because only in that gap between who he was and who they thought he was could he see the truth clearly. He glanced at the napkin hidden in his pocket, the words still burning. Today they spit in your food. This place is not safe. Whoever wrote it had taken a risk that could cost everything. Malcolm felt the familiar shift in his chest, the same one he felt every time he discovered a system hiding its cruelty under polish. The same one that meant the night ahead would not end quietly. It never did. Cradle did not whisper elegance. It announced it. From the moment Malcolm stepped inside, the air seemed heavier, perfumed with money and memory. The foyer was lined with velvet drapes that muted every sound, chandeliers that spilled gold light across polished mahogany floors, and walls decorated with oil portraits of Confederate generals. Their names were carefully left off the plaques, as though the lack of labels could erase the weight of history. Guests lowered their voices as they entered. Not out of reverence but performance. This was not a restaurant where people came hungry. It was a stage where power rehearsed itself nightly. Malcolm knew at the moment the hostess's eyes swept over him. She wore a fitted black dress and carried her clipboard like a shield. Her gaze lingered not on his face, but on his hoodie, on the sneakers too ordinary for the marble beneath his feet. "Do you have a reservation, sir?" she asked, her tone flat, rehearsed. "No." Malcolm replied evenly. "Just one." She hesitated, exhaling slowly, a sigh calibrated to let him know he was an inconvenience. "We're fully booked tonight." The words were delivered with the kind of smile that pretended to be polite but landed as dismissal. Then after a beat she added, "I suppose we can seat you near the kitchen entrance if that works." "It will," Malcolm said. His voice was calm, unbothered, but inside he noted every detail. The lift of her eyebrow, the subtle pivot of her heels as though guiding him out of sight. He followed her through the grand dining room, passing table after table draped in white linen and crystal. Every seat was filled with white diners in tailored suits and designer dresses, their laughter bouncing like champagne bubbles under the chandeliers. Not a single black face in sight, unless you counted the staff gliding between tables, silent, efficient, invisible. The hostess let him past the center of the room, past the corners that caught the candlelight just right, and stopped at a table near the swinging service doors. The smell of bleach wafted out every time they opened, mingling with the aroma of truffle butter and seared wagyu. She placed a menu before him without a smile, the gesture more warning than welcome, then disappeared back into the golden glow of the main room. Malcolm sat quietly, scanning the stage before him. The waitstaff smiled brighter when they approached tables marked by Rolexes and country club rings. The manager, a middle-aged white man with slick-back hair and a wine-colored tie, made his rounds like a politician at a fundraiser. His name was Mr. Clay. He shook hands, laughed too loudly at jokes that weren't funny, leaned close to listen to whispered requests. But when he passed Malcolm's table, his eyes didn't pause, not even for courtesy. To him, Malcolm was not a guest. He was furniture. That was the part that cut deepest. Not the seat by the kitchen. Not the hostess's sigh. It was the invisibility, the way the system ran so smoothly you could almost believe it wasn't there. Almost. A couple at the next table glanced his way. The man leaned in toward his date, whispering something behind a smirk. She covered her mouth as if to stifle a laugh. Malcolm didn't move. He had learned long ago that silence could be sharper than any reply. He let their laughter fade into the clinking of glasses. Let the sound of the bleach-scented doors remind him why he was here, because the cradle wasn't broken. It was working exactly as designed. He knew it, and now he was seeing it. And then, across the room she appeared, the waitress. She moved with quiet grace, carrying a tray balanced steady though her shoulders bore the weight of exhaustion. She wasn't loud, she wasn't flashy, but her eyes were alive, sharp beneath the tiredness, like a blade wrapped in velvet. For just a moment. As she passed between tables, her gaze met his. It wasn't long enough to count as conversation, not even recognition, but it was enough. Enough to tell Malcolm she saw him, enough to tell her that he wasn't like the others. In that brief collision of eyes, the performance cracked. For the first time that evening, the stage faltered and something real flickered in the shadows. Neither of them knew it yet, but that single glance would change everything. Naomi Brooks had learned to move without making noise. At 25, her steps were as measured as her breaths, her smile practiced like armor. She had walked through the side door of the cradle that night already bracing herself for the weight of another double shift. The black apron tied tight around her waist, the notepad tucked into her pocket, the pen clipped at the ready. It was all routine, yet beneath it lived the pieces of a different life, one she once believed was hers. Naomi had dreamed of becoming a civil rights lawyer. She had spent 2 years at Howard, late nights buried in case studies, afternoons marching in protests, mornings believing she could bend the system toward justice. Then her mother's diagnosis arrived like a wrecking ball. Cancer, stage 3. The scholarships couldn't stretch far enough, the medical bills stacked higher than any textbook. And suddenly, the weight of family mattered more than the weight of ambition. Naomi packed her life into a single suitcase, left the law library behind, and came back to Charleston. The cradle was the first place to hire her. The money was better than most service jobs, enough to keep the lights on at home, but the air inside was suffocating. She was the only black waitress on staff, and though no one said it out loud, the message was clear in how they scheduled her. Always the least desirable tables. Always the longest shifts. Always the first to blame when something went wrong. That night, before she had even clocked in, Mr. Clay had reminded her of her place. "You're late," he snapped, though the clock showed she was 5 minutes early. His smile was wide but cold, the kind of smile that told her he could make her vanish from the schedule if he felt like it. "Don't make me regret keeping you on." Naomi bit her tongue, nodded, and slipped past him into the dining room. She had learned silence was safer. In the kitchen, Chef Rick smirked as she reached for a stack of clean glasses. "Hope you're not waiting for a tip from table 8, he said loud enough for the others to hear. "Black folks don't usually leave one, do they?" Laughter bubbled from the sous chef beside him. Naomi didn't flinch. She had grown used to their jokes, ugly little barbs thrown like darts meant to remind her she didn't belong. She filed it away like she always did. Stored the sting behind her calm face. The truth was she noticed everything. The way Clay leaned longer at the tables of wealthy white patrons, his voice syrupy sweet, then turned sharp when speaking to her. The way the other servers whispered when she was assigned double shifts. The way Rick's eyes narrowed whenever a black customer sat down, as if service was charity instead of duty. Naomi's silence wasn't weakness. It was survival. She carried the weight of bills at home, her mother's medication, the feeling that she was living someone else's life instead of her own. She smiled through insults because the paycheck meant rent paid and food on the table. But even armor wears thin. That night felt different. As she wove between tables, balancing trays heavy with wagyu and wine, she noticed the man at table 14. He didn't fit the mold. No Rolex, no sharp suit, no impatient snapping of fingers. A plain hoodie, off-brand sneakers, eyes that were calm but observant. When she greeted him, he did something most never did. He looked her in the eye, really looked, as though he saw past the apron, past the rehearsed smile, past the exhaustion. That moment, small as it was, cracked something loose inside her, because Naomi was more than a waitress. She was a witness. She had watched every quiet injustice that played out in this restaurant, every whispered slur, every joke that landed like a stone in her chest. And now here was a man who sat silently at the worst table in the house, a man who didn't complain, didn't demand, but noticed. She couldn't explain why it mattered, only that it did. For the first time in months, she felt seen. As the laughter of wealthy diners rang behind her and the weight of Clay's cold gaze lingered at her back, Naomi carried on with her shift, pouring wine, clearing plates, swallowing her pride. But inside her chest, the pressure built. The humiliation, the exhaustion, the injustice, they were stacking higher with every hour. And somewhere deep down, beneath the armor of silence, Naomi knew she was nearing a breaking point. What she didn't know yet was that the man in the hoodie, the one who looked at her like she wasn't invisible, would be the reason she finally chose to act. The presidential prime was never just a steak. It was a spectacle, a 48-ounce cut of bone-in Wagyu dry-aged for months, plated with a truffle potato tower and unveiled beneath a glass dome of rosemary smoke. Guests ordered it to be seen, not to be fed. That night, as the kitchen prepared the dish for table 14, Naomi moved like she always did, quiet, efficient, unnoticed. But then she saw it. Chef Rick leaned over the sizzling beef, his grin twisted, his eyes sharp with cruelty, and in one quick motion, too fast to stop, too deliberate to mistake, he spat. The hiss of meat hitting the pan masked the act, but Naomi saw. The sous chef chuckled, shaking his head like this was routine, like it was a joke they had told too many times. Naomi froze, a plate balanced in her hand, her chest tightening. Her first instinct was denial. Maybe she misread it. Maybe it was an accident, but the laughter killed that hope. This wasn't new, this was normal. Her stomach turned, her mind raced. She had seen unfairness before, slurs muttered, tips withheld, tables skipped. But this was different. This was poison disguised as dinner, humiliation disguised as service. Her pulse hammered against her ribs as the steak was plated, polished, crowned with the glass dome. She knew the rules. She was supposed to carry it out, smile, present it like theater. She also knew the risk. If she said nothing, she would keep her job, keep her fragile paycheck, keep her life steady, at least on the surface. If she spoke up, she could lose everything. Rent, medicine, dignity, all gone with a single wrong word. Naomi's hands trembled as she reached for a napkin, the linen stiff beneath her fingers. She pulled a pen from her pocket, the same pen she used to write orders, and pressed it to the fabric. The ink bled across the fine thread, her breath catching with each word. Today they spit in your food. This place is not safe. Asked to see the kitchen cameras. She didn't sign it. She didn't dare. She folded the napkin once, tight and sharp, slipping it into her apron just as the server's bell chimed for pickup. Her heartbeat was a drumbeat in her ears as she lifted the plate, the dome catching the light, the smell of rosemary thick around her. She carried it past the other servers, past the swinging doors, into the hum of the dining room where laughter and crystal clinks drowned her panic. Her eyes found him. Table 14. The man in the hoodie, sitting calm and watchful at the worst seat in the house. He looked up as she approached, his expression unreadable but his gaze steady. Naomi placed the plate before him, lifted the dome with practiced grace, and whispered the same line she always did. "Enjoy your meal, sir." But as she cleared the bread plate with her right hand, her left slipped the folded napkin beneath the corner of his setting. A second later, she was gone. Moving to the next table like nothing had happened, heart pounding so hard she thought the sound might give her away. Malcolm sat still, his fork untouched, his eyes lingering on the place where her hand had been. Naomi didn't look back. She couldn't. She only hoped he would understand. In that moment, her silence broke, not with a shout, not with a scene, but with ink scrawled on a napkin. It wasn't just a warning about a steak. It was an alarm bell against a system that had thrived on quiet cruelty for too long, and she had chosen to ring it. The office smelled faintly of polish and stale bourbon, a space dressed in authority but thin beneath the surface. The walls were lined with framed awards, plaques engraved with vague titles, certificates that looked impressive until you noticed the cheap frames. It was theater, just like the dining room outside, a performance of excellence to cover rot. Malcolm stepped inside without invitation. Behind the desk sat Mr. Clay, his tie loosened, his smile stretched too wide. He motioned to the chair opposite, but Malcolm did not sit. Instead, he let the silence hang heavy, his eyes scanning the walls, the fake trophies of a system built on lies. "Is everything all right, sir?" Clay asked finally, his tone warm but his eyes sharp, scanning for complaint or tip. "I'd like to see your kitchen cameras," Malcolm said, his voice low but steady. Clay's smile flickered, then returned thinner. "The cameras," he repeated, as if the word itself was foreign. "Yes," Malcolm replied, "specifically around the time my meal was prepared." Clay chuckled softly, a practiced deflection. "Our cameras are primarily for inventory and safety, not guest concerns. They archive in 30-minute blocks, and sometimes the feeds loop automatically if storage is full." "Unfortunately, that's fine," Malcolm cut in. "Show me tonight's feed." Clay hesitated, shifting in his chair, the false confidence draining just a fraction. "Sir, I would need to get approval for that," he said, tapping his pen against the desk. "Approvals take time." Malcolm leaned forward, his shadow stretching across the fake certificates. "Then consider this your approval." Clay swallowed. He rose reluctantly, moving to a corner cabinet, fumbling with a key that clinked against the lock. He retrieved a small external drive, plugged it into the monitor on his desk, and began to scroll. For a moment, the screen showed the prep station clearly. Chefs moving with mechanical efficiency. Then, abruptly, the footage skipped. 2 minutes and 12 seconds vanished in a blink, the exact window when Naomi had been waiting for the steak. Clay tapped the keyboard again, pretending to troubleshoot, but his hand trembled. Malcolm's voice sliced through the room. "Enough." Clay froze. The only sound was the faint hum of the monitor. Malcolm straightened, his face carved in stone. "Do you know what I see when footage skips like that?" he asked quietly. "I see intent. I see someone who thought the truth could be erased." Clay opened his mouth, then closed it. Forehead glistened with sweat under the yellow light. "Sir, if I may ask, who exactly are you?" Malcolm leaned closer, his words dropping like iron. "I'm the man who signs your checks." The silence that followed was absolute. Clay's mouth twitched, his bravado collapsing under the weight of those words. The mask of polished authority fell away, revealing panic. His carefully curated performance had no lines left to read from. "You're either the man who helps fix a problem in his house," Malcolm continued, "or you're the man who buries it. And tonight, you don't get to bury anything." Clay sank back into his chair, the color draining from his face. He stammered something about system errors, about misunderstandings, but the words rang hollow. Malcolm didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need threats or theatrics. His calm was the sharpest weapon in the room. He pulled his phone from his pocket, tapped a secure app, and sent a message with 3 words. "Partial footage. Tampering suspected." Then he slipped the phone away and let the silence return. Outside the office door, the restaurant buzzed with laughter, glasses clinking, forks scraping plates, the hum of a world still oblivious. Inside, time stood still. Clay sat sweating, cornered by truth he could no longer control. Malcolm didn't shout. He didn't move. He simply looked at the man across the desk and let him understand that the performance was over. The reckoning had begun, and there was no script left to save him. The next morning, the cradle looked unchanged from the outside, its white columns gleaming in the Charleston sun, the velvet ropes arranged neatly, the name etched in brass above the door. But beneath the surface, the stage was set for a performance no one expected. By noon, the sidewalk outside was crowded with journalists clutching microphones, cameras balanced on tripods, and curious bystanders craning for a better view. Guests in pearls and press suits still arrived as if nothing had happened, prepared to sip their wine and whisper over truffle butter, unaware the script of their afternoon was about to shatter. The double doors opened, but instead of a hostess with a polite smile, 2 plainclothes federal agents stepped inside. They didn't raise their voices. They didn't need to. The hum of conversation fell silent as they moved with precision through the dining room. Chef Rick, still in his stained apron, looked up from the kitchen pass. His smirk evaporated as one agent clasped his wrist, clicked on steel cuffs, and pulled him toward the door. The sous chef followed, eyes wide, protests dying in his throat. Then came Mr. Clay, the manager who had spent years laughing too loudly, shaking the right hands and ignoring the rest. He froze for a fraction of a second, then tried to slip toward the back exit. Another agent was waiting. The cuffs closed with a snap. And suddenly, the man who once strutted through the dining room like a politician was being walked out like a thief. Phones lifted into the air, recording, flashing, streaming live. Gasps filled the silence, some guests whispering in disbelief, others clapping softly as though justice itself demanded applause. Outside, Malcolm DeVoe stepped forward onto the stone steps. He wore the same navy hoodie, but this time he wasn't trying to disappear. This time, every eye was on him. A podium had been placed at the entrance, microphones crowding the space like hungry mouths. He rested his hands on either side, scanning the crowd. Yesterday I entered this building as a customer, Malcolm began, his voice steady, each word measured. Today I stand before you as its owner. What I saw inside, what I uncovered, does not reflect the values of Darrow Holdings or this community. His gaze swept across the reporters, across the stunned faces of diners still lingering on the sidewalk. This was not a bad apple, it was a poison tree, and we are cutting it down. Cameras clicked, pens scratched furiously, but Malcolm didn't rush. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink into the marble and the headlines alike. Then he gestured to his right. Naomi Brooks stepped forward. She wasn't dressed in the black apron of last night. She wore a tailored navy blouse and slacks, her hair pulled back, her hands clasped tight to steady their trembling. She didn't smile, she didn't wave, but she stood tall. This woman, Malcolm said, showed more integrity in one night than most executives manage in an entire career. She is the reason this truth came to light. She is the reason this place has a future. Naomi's throat tightened, the sound of applause crashing around her like a wave. For months she had been invisible, just another server slipping silently between tables. Now every camera pointed at her, every lens capturing the moment she could no longer be erased. Her knees shook for a heartbeat. But then she steadied herself, lifting her chin, anchoring her presence beside the man who had chosen to listen. Effective immediately, Malcolm continued, Naomi Brooks will serve as the Cradle's new Director of Ethics and Culture. Her voice will not only be heard, it will guide how this institution moves forward. The words landed like thunder. Reporters shouted questions, flashes burst, the applause swelled. Naomi blinked hard against the sting in her eyes, but she did not waver. She had carried trays and endured slurs, filed away humiliation behind forced smiles. And now she stood here as the leader of a rebirth. Some in the crowd clapped with genuine force, others simply stared, stunned that a woman they once ignored could suddenly embody the very future of the place they had praised. But for Naomi, the noise was background. What mattered was the truth. She had risked everything on a folded napkin, and that risk had not just exposed corruption. It had rewritten her life. Beside her, Malcolm placed a steady hand on the podium, his expression calm, unflinching. "We are not canceling the Cradle," he said, his voice sharp enough to slice through the chaos. "We are rebuilding it, from the inside out. And this time it will serve more than food. It will serve justice." The applause that followed was not polite. It was raw, unfiltered, and real. In that moment, as the cameras rolled and the agents loaded Clay and Rick into unmarked cars, the balance of power shifted. The weak were no longer voiceless, and the system that had thrived on silence had been dragged into the light. And for the first time in a long time, Naomi Brooks stood not as a witness, not as a servant, but as the beginning of something new. 2 weeks later, the Cradle looked nothing like the place Malcolm had walked into. The velvet drapes remained, the chandeliers still shimmered, but the portraits of Confederate generals were gone. In their place hung framed photographs of Charleston's unsung black pioneers, chefs who had built kitchens from nothing, artists whose work once hung only in community centers, leaders who had spoken when no one wanted to listen. The dining room felt different now, lighter, honest. At the center of it all, Naomi Brooks stood before her staff. No podium, no polished speech. Just a circle of chairs pulled into the middle of the floor, the same floor where laughter once disguised cruelty. She looked around at the faces, some nervous, some skeptical, most listening. Her hands clasped loosely in front of her, not to hide trembling, but to ground herself. 2 weeks ago she had been carrying plates no one respected. Now she carried something heavier, the responsibility to build a culture from ashes. She took a breath. "Silence is never neutral," she said. Her voice was steady, low, but every ear caught it. "That napkin I slipped across a table, it wasn't just about a steak. It was about a system. And if I had stayed quiet, it would still be here today, hurting people, humiliating people." She paused, letting the words settle. Then she added, "I'm not asking you to be loud every day. I'm asking you to be honest, to act when it matters, even if it costs you something. Because silence always costs more." A few heads lowered, a few eyes flicked away, but others nodded. Someone in the back whispered "yeah" under their breath, not mocking but agreeing. For the first time since she took the role, Naomi felt the ground beneath her shift, not against her but with her. Across the room, unnoticed by most, Malcolm leaned against the doorway, still in his hoodie. Hands in his pockets, he didn't interrupt. He didn't need to. He watched as Naomi carried the moment, as the staff listened not to an executive or a manager, but to someone who had lived the truth of what silence allows. Pride flickered across his face, not the pride of a savior, but of a man who had chosen to listen at the right time. Naomi continued, "I was raised to believe that courage looked like marches and microphones. but sometimes it looks like a napkin. Folded in half, written in haste. Sometimes it's quiet, sometimes it's small, but it can start something bigger than all of us. The room was silent, but it was no longer the silence of fear. It was the silence that comes when people feel the weight of truth. Outside, sunlight spilled through the tall windows, catching on the new frames, the new faces on the walls. They watched as Naomi, once invisible, now guided the conversation about what kind of place the cradle would become. Malcolm let the scene etch itself into memory. 2 weeks ago, the story had begun with 4 words scrawled across linen. Today, those words had grown into a legacy, one built not on secrecy but on truth. The cradle was no longer just a restaurant. It was a reminder that the smallest act of defiance can split open a system of cruelty, that justice can start in whispers, not shouts, and that courage, once lit, can turn into something no one can extinguish. For the staff, for Naomi, for Malcolm, and for everyone listening now, the lesson was clear. Change doesn't come from silence. It comes from the risk of speaking at all. If you enjoyed this story, let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.